The Ukraine conflict is a seminal change in the way we are seeing our security in space. In fact, we were seeing those threats appearing, of course, but that has given a sense of urgency, in fact, of the way we need to treat the matter and make sure that we can counter those threats right now. If we had that discussion 3 years ago, of course, and say this is something we have to start thinking about and we're trying to design and to put out concept, it would happen sometimes and we had to prepare for it. But now it's there. So there is this sense of urgency.
Hello SpaceWatchers and welcome to our second series of our special collaboration with the Prague Security Studies Institute PSSI. I'm Thorsten Greening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global. 2 years ago at their 6th Prague Space Security Conference, we launched a joint project with them to create a special podcast miniseries focused on allied preparedness to face the rapidly evolving space security landscape. It's an absolute pleasure for us to partner with PSSI, a non-profit, non-governmental public policy organization founded in early 2002 and based in Prague. The Institute, among its activities, it seeks to illuminate, select unconventional threats emanating from authoritarian governments that challenge the transatlantic alliance and other partners globally, especially in the economic, financial and space domains. All the interviews in this Space Security miniseries were conducted during the 7th Prague Space Security Conference, held from 16th to the 18th of June 2024. The traditionally biannual event will now be held every year. It has become a well-known and established high-level conference series with senior officials from Europe, the US and Japan. For the first time, there were also representatives from South Korea and Taiwan, as well as selected experts from industry and academia. This series, launched in 2011, is designed to advance allied policy decision-making on critical space security issues. This unclassified gathering brings together the highest level of military allies, national security experts, and senior industry representatives. This first episode starts with Commander of the French Space Command, Major General Philippe Adam. He took over the command from Major General Friedling on 1st July 2022. Enjoy that first episode of our mini-series. Major General Philippe Adam, thank you very much for this interview. What are we doing in Europe from a defense point of view to secure the stability of our space assets?
Hello, Thorsten, and thank you very much for having me and for this very interesting question. It's very interesting because, as usual, some terms of it needs to be defined, of course. And what we have in mind when we talk about stability is probably out of question. So I will just talk about what stability is for me, and I'm not really sure that everybody can agree on that definition. So stability is what allows you to forecast a situation. So if a situation is unstable, of course, you don't control anything, and the situation can change dramatically from one second to the other, from one day to the other. So stability for us, and especially for space, is making sure that all the conditions stay what they are now so that we can continue our business in space, taking advantage of it, providing services from space, etc. So how is stability threatened drives the measures we have to take as European nations to protect this stability. And of course, I will talk about European nations and not Europe as a political organizations. I think that even countries out of the EU are doing things to protect stability, and we are all working together on that. So protecting stability has a lot to do, of course, with sustainability in space. It has a lot to do with security, of course. Security is threatened by many things. It's threatened by the environment, by the increase in activity in space, but also by new behaviors that could be problematic for the future and could become a real threat. And threat is a danger for somebody, plus an intent from somebody to hurt somebody else. So for that, European nations have all realized that they needed to do something because space is important to their everyday lives, to their economy and many things. And we have to defend and protect the state of play. So defending and protect is a mission that is given to the military usually. And that's where you can see that all around Europe, space commands are created so that somebody is working on that mission and trying to take action to defend those services that we need for our everyday life. Another side, of course, that everybody is working on is a question of debris or preventing collisions in space. And that's usually the question of debris. If you've got two active satellites, of course, both operators will maneuver those satellites and prevent a collision. But when it's a debris, it's completely uncontrolled and you have to do something. And the question of how do we remove debris from space that will prevent further space exploitation is raising as well. So there's a lot of work to do, not that much action, but we see companies working on that and probably we see some things in the future. With that, of course, we have to talk a little bit about freedom of access to space. That goes with it, of course. If you are free to maneuver and operate in space, you have also to be free to climb up there and to fly your satellites. So that's another area where European nations are working together through ESA, but also through their own agencies and companies, try to develop new launchers. Of course, the best known is Ariane 6, but you can also see all the companies created to start small launcher businesses and to work on reusability and this kind of thing. So that goes with it. And I think that's another aspect of protecting stability, so that nobody can prevent us from going into space. Of course, with launchers, we have also to work on launch sites. We need to multiply launch sites, but that's, if you have more companies trying to launch, of course, you will multiply, and that's a necessary consequence. And you can have also mobile launch sites. You can try different ways of launching rockets in the future as well. So there's a lot of developments. It's very attractive. Launchers, rockets are sexy. So it attracts a lot of attention and, of course, a lot of also engineers and a lot of people interested in space matters want to work on launchers. And then to complete this already pretty long answer, I think we have also to consider all the legal aspects of what stability or sustainability can bring. And there's an interesting line of work with trying to define and agree on what is responsible in space and what is not. So this discussion about responsible behaviors is pretty interesting because I think it will drive the way we can exploit space in the future. And the discussion will be long, of course. It needs an agreement between almost all nations in the world because all nations now are using space, so they are all stakeholders in that discussion. This legal discussion is also very important. And the last thing, of course, is if you have multiple operators now, well, the operators are multiplying. It's just like on the street or on the roads when people are driving their car, you expect them to behave normally according to rules, but also to know how to operate their cars or their trucks or their bicycles for that matter. So training is important as well, and standardization in training is important. And you can see as well that in Europe are created lots of schools, training facilities, academies for space. And I think that also indicates all the importance that space has taken for our nations. And if you add all the initiatives in all the domains I just described, I think you have a good picture of what Europe is doing for stability in the future.
Thank you very much for this very interesting answer. You tackled a lot of areas, which in each of us we could dive in, and we partially will. But help me, in the last 2 years, we have seen, unfortunately, the war in the Ukraine. So how did this conflict change the entire system or our awareness for space?
The Ukraine conflict is a seminal change in the way we are seeing our security in space. In fact, we were seeing those threats appearing, of course, but that has given a sense of urgency, in fact, of the way we need to treat the matter and make sure that we can counter those threats right now. If we had the discussion 3 years ago, of course, we'd say this is something we have to start thinking about, and we're trying to design and to put out concept and to design. It was more theoretical. It would happen sometimes, and we had to prepare for it. But now it's there. So there is this sense of urgency. We need to do something right now because those threats are out there. And what the Ukrainian war tells us as well, it's that in a major conflict, this war is a real war. It's a shooting war, killing many people. The combatant, of course, will try to get the advantage on the other by any means that they can use, of course. And one of the use to diminish their enemy's capability is to attack their space capabilities, because space capabilities or space services are very useful. Use them to locate your troops, to target, to communicate, and to get information on the battlefield. So if you can attack your adversary's capability, of course, you will do it. And they are doing it every day in Ukraine, which is also something we have to observe, that those threats are out there and we need to be ready for that. And of course, for a military, it's very important to understand what the next war will look like so that we are well prepared. And even if that was something we watched coming, in fact, now we need to put things in place really for us to make sure we can operate for next war if it comes. Of course, the main thing we need to do is to prevent that war to happen, of course. But if it happens, we need to be ready, and we have to consider war in space as well.
By reading your bio, I learned that you have been active in war scenes and war scenarios within your career. And the question you just raised, I think it's super important. How will a war in the future will look like? Space was introduced as a fifth warfighting domain by NATO a while back, and that was before the Ukraine war. So what changed since that point? Is space in all the militaries, in all the NATO militaries, taken seriously?
Space as a new warfighting domain is an interesting point made by NATO, so that it clarifies the concept of warfighting domains, by the way, and introduces the fact that now, instead of considering just the three classical domains, the air, sea, and land, we also have to take into account cyber and space. So what does that mean is that when it was already quite difficult, in fact, to adjust your operations, making sure that all three classical domains were operating together and maximizing the effects on the battlefield by combining their effects all together, now you have to take care about 5 of them with different battle rhythms, of course, and things you need to anticipate completely differently, and mechanics that are specific to each domain, of course. That makes things a bit more complex, and that was a very good move from NATO to declare it as early. So that launched the preparation for the creation of space commands, and they did the same. So what did change since that declaration, of course? But NATO has to prepare as well to integrate space into their operations. If there is a major crisis that requests to defend the European territory, of course, NATO will be engaged for our countries, and they will probably be in charge of military operations, and they have to take account and to take care of the space domain as well, because space, again, will be necessary for all the other domains. In fact, all the space services are really necessary for the other domains to conduct their own operations. So it's something that is clear now. Now the question is how we do it. And of course, now we have to agree between allies of what is necessary within the NATO structure and what will remain in the hands of the nations, but will contribute ultimately, just like any kind of force. But then it's a new construct that we have to adjust. In fact, and the first thing is make sure that the NATO structure has all the expertise and ability to take space into account for their operations. And that's where we are now. And they are progressing, of course. They are progressing at the pace the allies progress, of course. It's difficult to let NATO go too fast. In fact, if the nations can't follow, it can look a bit slow at times, but I think the progress is real and it's interesting. And also NATO has a very interesting role in making sure that all the countries are working together and are working on the same basis, of course, and conceptual and doctrinal basis is important to train and to design your capabilities.
What I hear is that it's work in progress and we are not there where we could be. Is that a correct assessment of your words?
It is correct. Well, in military preparation, it's always work in progress. You never stop.
Okay, fair point.
It's a new domain, and I think we are getting there pretty fast. Of course, we are very impatient because, again, war is at our door. But we can imagine, okay, without a war in Ukraine, for example, maybe it would have taken 10 years to get where we are now, and that took only 2 years or 3 years. So I think the progress is still there. And again, for progress to be positive, it has to be thought through, it has to be solid in its thinking, but also in the nation's contributions. And that takes time, of course. Resources are scarce. We have to fight for that.
Do we need a European defense solution over or together with NATO solutions to reach this, as General Trout mentioned, the unity of efforts? So how do you see that? So how independent can we be?
It's a question that has a very political edge. But I will try to answer on the practical side and the practitioner side. So as a military, of course, the alliance and NATO is composed essentially of European countries. Of course, we welcome and we are pretty glad to have the US and Canadian support if something happens in Europe, of course. Just have to remind also from time to time that when the US were attacked, of course, NATO jumped to their rescue. It was not necessary, but it was proposed to the US to defend them. So what we need to consider, and again, it comes back to the question of what will the next war look like? We have to consider the possibility of when this war happens, the US or Canada, North America, is not in a position where they can support us directly because they will be engaged somewhere else, because there will be constraints, because there will be impediments for them to help us. So there is clearly an interest in making sure that there is some sort of autonomy, as big an autonomy as possible in Europe, so that we can find together waiting for the US to come, or knowing that the US will not come. And I'm pretty sure that we have everything we need, in fact, to build that autonomy. Now, of course, the more we are fighting, the easier it will be to win that war, of course. It doesn't mean that we don't need the US in the alliance. We will do everything we need to keep them in, of course. But I think that it's a practical necessity to make sure that we can fight even if they are not there. And that's the other thing I could mention on that regard, of course, is even if the US is there, the best way we can combine our efforts is making sure that we are good allies, in fact. So if we develop our capabilities, and that's a signal that the US sends us regularly, by the way, is that if we increase our investment, our training, our level of preparation for that war, it will be easier for everybody who wants to win the war. It will be a smaller sacrifice for them. It is a sacrifice. The US coming to fight in Europe, of course, they are making a sacrifice. It's very generous if you think about it. And that's if you prepare correctly. And if Europe is correctly prepared and doesn't count too much and has nice and efficient fighting capabilities, it will be easier for them as well. And so it will be easier for them as well to commit to that war. But that, again, it's also a very political question, of course. But if you think just of you will fight that war, it's always good to be well prepared, and that's an interesting signal. It always ends in making sure that the European countries are preparing accordingly to the level of threat.
Let's do a reality check. And you mentioned scarce resources before. How can we avoid uncoordinated national initiatives, security initiatives, via allies' coordinated ones? And allies can be, in our case, and obviously NATO. The reason why I'm asking is what I'm learning talking with militaries is that passport matters, even in Europe. If you're holding a French passport, you are qualified to observe, to use classified material in France, but not in Germany, nor in Italy, and vice versa. So where are we on that? How national are we still in our defense thinking?
I don't want to give too broad an answer on this. On space, again, there are two aspects. So interoperability of means and services, I think is clear. We are currently exchanging services from our satellites, whether they are SATCOMs or imagery. The ways of exchanging this kind of information exist, and we do it every day, especially between Germany and France, but also with Italy. And we get lots of pictures also and information and data from the US and from all the others that can contribute. So interoperability between satellites or capability is not really the issue. It's more the way we design those forces, in fact, and the way we construct the space capability in general, if I read your question a bit further. And that's why I wanted to come back to the nation's situation. I think all the nations are the same right now. They discovered that they had a problem and they need to make sure that they can provide a little bit of security to their own space activity because they are necessary to their own national economies and way of living. And that's the way it should be. In fact, you have to take care of your own problems before taking care of others. And because we are all trying to catch up and to develop and deploy things that we are probably a bit late already, but we need to do that quickly. Mm-hmm. I don't see any reason why I should stop or slow down countries just to make sure that everybody is at the same pace. I think it will probably be better to let everybody try to clean its own room and then make sure that we can work together. And it works. Space is a good example for that because you don't need to mix your capabilities. We are on the same area of responsibility, area of operation all the time. Whether you design it like that or not, you are always operating together. All the satellites are operating in space all together. And whether you want it or not, whether you planned it or not, the interoperability is by design to some point. Because you know how to communicate, you know how to coordinate between your operations. And again, you know how to exchange data, even if you have a little bit of format change to do before you deliver to your partner. So it's not completely coordinated, but it is coordinated in some way. Now, the next step will be certainly, and to come back to the previous question, to make sure that nothing is missing in the full European inventory. And that, again, that will show, and your question shows that you are preoccupied of making sure that there is some autonomy in Europe. If we coordinate, it's exactly for that. So that we've got all the parts we need to have a complete set of capabilities so that we can fight in Europe, in NATO, and then you can set or define what size of an alliance or a coalition you want to talk about. And it will depend on the crisis. It will depend on the war. Of course, the war is in Europe. It's everybody, of course.
That's in Article 5.
Article 5, of course.
I would like to elaborate a bit more on the current level of data sharing, including the ongoing declassification of data as we hear it among the allies. Maybe you can give us an idea where we are. You just mentioned data that you're creating today are shared and can be with some kind of adaptation shared among others. Who are the allies in that case? You mentioned Germany and France, but is it then on the NATO level or is it another club of nations?
That's a very clever question. So the clever answer is it depends. But it's exactly that.
But you're military, you're not a lawyer. So I didn't expect that answer.
Again, let's come back to the practitioner answer, which is, okay, do you exchange just pure data or do you exchange information or do you exchange intelligence? And that changes things, of course. With that comes the level of classification. Now, what is changing now is that what appeared like pure data but was classified because it was rare and considered as a very precious and strategic data that needed to be protected is no longer. If you consider a space data, like a picture taken from an EO satellite, you can probably find exactly the same picture from a commercial source. And this one is non-classified. It's not only unclassified, it's never been classified at all. So it's available on the market. So why do you classify your pictures? Just because they are coming from a satellite that you fly. There are reasons for that, of course, and probably we are not completely ready to provide everything for free. But I think it's this reflection and those questions and those discussions are going in the right direction. And again, considering that now the information you need or the data you need from space will be available. If they are not available now, they will be available very soon on the commercial markets. It's not necessary to protect them, or certainly not at the level we were protecting them in the past. Now, there are also agreements, there are also classification levels that have been decided in the past that are very difficult to change. Now we have to think about future capabilities and future data. To come back on the picture example, we have agreements with some partners, of course, to exchange data. For example, SAR pictures against CSO pictures. And of course, if you give everything for free, where do these agreements stand? Of course, you can't do that. The other thing, the answer on the question, a very similar question was raised on the panel just before I came here, is, okay, can you share everything you have? And the answer was no, because some data we use are commercial data. And if I give them for free, I buy them and then give them for free. Of course, I kill the business of this company that has sold the data in the first place. So, of course, you can't. Several questions, but it's going in the right direction. There is a real will to exchange more and to make it easier for partners, but there will be some constraints and limits to all that. And probably there will be different types of answer depending on the type of data and who you are talking to. And again, if it's unclassified, it's commercial. It doesn't mean it's public. And of course, it's the business of somebody. So it's not because it's unclassified that you will get access to it for nothing. So it's another way of saying, okay, it's not because it's there that you have access to it. And how you protect its access is also a different thing.
Copernicus is one example.
Copernicus is a good example.
My last question is, what are short-term challenges we or Europe need to solve in space in terms of space safety and security from your point of view?
I think the next challenge is probably a mix of all the answers to all the questions you asked so far. Right now, the first thing to do is make sure that we share a common picture, a common operational picture. So that goes with sharing data, space surveillance data before talking about anything else, and making sure that what's happening in space is seen by everybody. Now, the next question will be, is it understood? And then the next question will be, okay, what do we do about it? But first, we need to make sure that all the nations, basically because all the nations have interests in space, can understand or can see at least what's happening up there. So that's lots of data sharing, but also human or man-machine interface as well. So that this data, which is pretty complex, is properly presented for people to be able to read it and to understand a critical situation when it happens.
General Adam, thank you very much for your time and for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Welcome. And thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us on the Space Café Radio Prague Space Security mini-series, supported by PSSI, the Prague Security Studies Institute. PSSI is the organizer of the 7th Prague Space Security Conference, part of a prestigious high-level conference series launched in 2011. If you wish to learn more about this topic, do not miss our second Prague Space Security series, available on all our channels. you.